Well, the Bank of Canada raised rates again this week, and it's putting even further strain on the already squeezed financial marketplace. And yet, there is still even talks of further rate hikes as soon as their next meeting happening in September. Meanwhile, we just had USA come in and give us their latest inflation print, which dropped to 3%, dropping a full 1%, similar to what Canada did. And keep in mind, Canada is now sitting at just 3.4%. And do you remember when 3% was the target? Well, maybe those goalposts are being moved again because the talks from the BOC have shifted. So we're going to dive into all of that, plus give you some insights into what's happening in both the Toronto real estate market, Calgary, and then, of course, a little bit closer to home here in Vancouver, and what we can likely expect to experience over the coming months. So with this rate hike, a lot of people are obviously feeling the mortgage payments more than they have even over the last 9 hikes previous. And if maybe you're an investor and maybe that property doesn't make sense anymore, or maybe you're considering when would be the right time to buy or sell that property, well, we're always happy to have that conversation. So please just reach out to any of the contact information below. Let's dive into it. Rate announcement off the top, obviously the big news. I'm sure you've already heard about it, but here we're going to dive into it a little bit ourselves here as well and share our thoughts. So, yep, BOC up a quarter point last week, or this week rather. The markets had priced it in correctly. It was a quarter point. I had willfully wished it not to happen. I was wrong. Ryan bet that it was going to happen. He was right. But either way, it is the 10th rate hike we've now seen dating back to March of 2002. And obviously the overnight rate here is at 5%. The overnight rate at 5% is now the highest it's been dating back 22 years to 2001. For reference, the average home in Vancouver in 2001 was $288,000. So people with average homes today priced at 1.2 million, almost $1 million higher than they were back when rates were this high, are facing very different payment challenges, as you could imagine. The hike came with a lot of the press release information saying that, look, the Canadian economy has basically been stronger than expected. The higher rates have not yet worked their way through the economy, is kind of what they're bolstering this latest hike on, and kind of justifying it, if you will. So even though they cited that, yeah, inflation has eased down to 3.4%, well, core, I guess, is running at 3 to 4% pace and has been more persistent than they anticipated. So again, they're kind of saying, okay, well, the shift is now over here because we've kind of achieved this, but guess what? There's other things that we need to discuss. The BOC, the Bank of Canada, is also adjusting their forecast as to when they can hit the 2% target. Now, keep in mind, their goal, what they often share, is they want to be between 1 and 3. But now they're saying, okay, well, 2% is the current target. And it's going to take until mid-2025 to hit that. That's 2 years out. Okay, we're at 3.4 today. They need to get to 2. And they're saying that's going to take 2 years. They had just extended that prediction by about 6 months because it used to be basically the end of 2024 here. So they're basically saying it's going to take 2 years to drop 1.4%. Okay, because we're at 3.4 today. Keep in mind, the US just announced that they're at 3%. They dropped a full 1% from the previous month, just like Canada did, right? Our previous print was to 4.4. But all of a sudden, it's going to take 2 full years to drop 1.4%. I get it. That last bit is obviously the stickiest and the hardest. But we've also dropped 4.7% in just the last 12 months. So we're going to know a lot more, of course, on July the 18th, because that is the date that the next announcement for Canadian inflation is going to be made. Understandably, if they keep rates at 5 or higher for the next 2 years, that will have well washed into the economy, into the marketplace, and definitely into housing, and you will see a radically different landscape. And it's not going to take 2 years to get that there, because we're feeling it now. Many people are feeling it now, and it feels like the people that are making these decisions are completely disconnected from the realities of what the average homeowner or renter today or food buyer is facing, because the pain is certainly being felt nationally and obviously globally, but we're Canada-based here. So the comments they're making about things like the economy being stronger than they had expected, well, it really seems like a lot of the data that they reference when they make these announcements is from lagging data. Okay, because yeah, sure, they're saying the labor market continues to add jobs at a robust pace, but the reality is we've also got unemployment rate increasing for 3 months in a row now. So I'm not sure if this labor market data they're referencing has been adjusted for population, because we talk about population almost every week now based on the incredible numbers that they are hitting here. Consumer spending, they're saying, was brisk for the first quarter. Well, what does that mean? You've also got another 1.2 million people in the country in the last 12 months that are adding to that metric. And yes, housing is unexpectedly strong. I mean, we've been talking about this for a while. We did not expect to see an increase in home prices in the first 6 months of 2023. Definitely not back in January when the landscape was what it was. And we know it's largely been based off of the very low inventory. That's the only reason that we're seeing house prices even move. But that is shifting, right? We discussed how median and average prices fell off in GBRD just last month. We're recording this on July the 14th. In the first 2 weeks of July data, prices are going down further. So this is happening prior to the last quarter point interest rate hike. Right now, we're going to likely expect a lot more of that downward pressure, but we'll dive into that in the later half of this podcast today. So where are we at here? The bank statement suggests that, hey, it may pause at 5%, but it may also continue. They're basically going case by case now, as they kind of always do, but they're certainly leaving the door open for continued rate hikes. So much so that as of Thursday, as of yesterday, when we recorded this, markets were pricing in a 75% chance of that hike on September the 6th. So dramatically changing landscape out there. Interest rate overnight rate at 5. People now have to qualify in the 7s, and they're paying well into the 6s for a mortgage. And well, pretty hard to do when home prices are almost just off of all-time high prices.
Yeah. And I mean, before I kind of jump into bond rates, I mean, there's a lot to unpack in what you just said. And I think I was going to save, I guess, my thoughts on the interest rate hikes for the last part of the episode here. But I think it's a good time right now to just kind of also complement what you've just said, because I was away in Osoyoos last week, and it was a really good indicator for me, and I think a leading indicator, not a lagging one, of where people are deciding to spend their dollars right now because things are getting tighter. When you drive through Osoyoos in the middle of July, normally, motels have been booked for months, right? You can't find any kind of hotels. Rates, if you can, are through the roof. But when I was there, only about 50% of the hotel I was staying at was occupied. There was vacancy amongst every single motel that was on the beachfront. Mind you, they were still asking $390 to $420 per night for a motel on the beach. And I think what we're starting to see right now is consumers are looking at that. One, they either don't have the disposable income to spend on a vacation like that. Two, they're choosing to deploy their dollars elsewhere. I know if you're trying to book a flight right now, it's very difficult. I know a lot of people are traveling outside of the country. And I think what you're going to start to see is some of those decisions and the dollars being deployed outside of BC. You're going to start to see prices for those businesses come down. But where it kind of gets a little scary, Dan, is where does that stop? Because if people are deciding to go and deploy their dollars on a trip to, say, Europe, or maybe they're going back to China or something to that effect, instead of deploying them here, those dollars will also never come back here. They will be spent in that economy, and then those businesses will struggle. They'll have to price adjust. And if even at that point, if interest rates stay high for longer, they'll suffer even more, right? So it won't take 2 years for a lot of these businesses to go under. It'll take way shorter time period in my mind than that. And I think the Bank of Canada is saying these things in order to shift the perspective and the way people are spending their money. But I don't think for 1 second that they'll be able to keep it at that high for that long without significant breakage in the economy. And kind of to that point, let's talk about bond rates right now. So the 5-year bond has exploded over the last couple of weeks. It hit 4% for the first time since 2007. This has pushed fixed rates up to around 5.2%. And the variable rate now sits at about 5.9%. It's like Dan said, you're qualifying in the sixes and sevens right now. It's crazy. Both of these are 15-year highs, right? And let's keep in mind the average price point 15 years ago was $531,000. It's now $1.2 million today. Affordability was already a challenge. It is being exacerbated now. So a buyer purchasing a typical home, for example, and financing at today's rates is looking at a monthly mortgage payment that is $330 higher than just 4 months ago. And that presents a unique challenge to most Canadians who at the end of every month have around $200 sitting in their bank account after they've been paid and their expenses wash out. So if interest rates are going up at a pace that is higher than what Canadians are able to save, you're going to have breakage. And this will continue to slow the market. This will continue to slow down behavior. Momentum will kind of ease off here. And I think we're only just starting to see the implications of the incredible rate hike that we went through taking place now. And I think probably we'll see a bit of a bounce in September, but then I think it'll cool off quite a bit, and to some very low levels by the end of the year.
Okay. Yeah, I think when people are facing this level of payment increases, and of course the majority of that payment when we're talking about housing is either going to interest payments, so you're not even seeing your principal go down, or you're paying all-time record high rents. Either way, that money is going towards housing because that's one of the first bills you're going to pay. And then of course you're going to pull back on things like trips to a Soyuz because that's just discretionary and extra spending. So if you can't afford these things and living in your home is now a challenge, the sentiment, your happiness level, your outlook on what you're going to buy, of course, comes down. And this is something that's quite closely tracked. And of course, what has happened very recently with sentiment is within the last month here is it's dropped. But it's dropped after, like the housing market, it had increased for the past 6 months. There was actually some positivity coming back into the marketplace. Well, that dropped as of last month here in the June print, and it slid 9 points. And it now is sitting around the lowest it's been since COVID, also back to earlier this year, January 2023, and the global financial crisis. So it changed a lot, and it changed quickly. So people simply, they don't feel like they can afford those day-to-day items, let alone their housing. So this is going to you're going to see pullback there in all areas. And ultimately, this is going to it's going to feed data to the BOC, but they may not see this for 3-4 months here. So giving them power to potentially still hike at the September meeting.
I think the US will also raise in September, and I think they could lean on that too as a good reason to be raising. But a lot of the betting money in the States is thinking that September will be the last rate hike that they have as well. So I do wonder how close we are to the top of the rate hike cycle. However, with that being said, like you mentioned, Dan, the BOC is definitely leaving the door open to further crush demand to bring price stability back to the marketplace. Speaking of employment, lower overall sentiment comes as we see early signs of a weakening labor market. Now, I know we just had, our employment figures jumped 60,000 new jobs last month, and that beat expectations. But a lot of those jobs are likely temporary jobs over the, preparing for the summer and that kind of thing. I don't see that as it's a bit of a one-off, because the month before that we saw 17,500 jobs that actually peeled out of the market. Before we were seeing growth. Now we're seeing a bit of turbulence, and I think after we see the turbulence, we'll start to see the declines. So I don't think we're there yet, but I think we're starting to see inconsistency, which is the first step. And then I think the next step is going to be businesses pulling back to survive through the next 6 to 12 months. So the internals were considerably less positive when you look at that report. The unemployment rate hit 5.4% nationally last month. That has now risen by 0.4% over the past 3 months, which is the largest non-lockdown related increase since 2019. So we're starting to see these metrics tick up now. And prior to that, you have to go back to the global financial crisis to find the last time the unemployment rate had ticked up to this degree.
So obviously, it's starting to happen, and it's the one of the metrics. Of course, if we see 3+ months of unemployment increasing, that's can be one of the metrics that shows that we're in a recession. So it hasn't happened quite yet because of GDP growth, but you get the idea here. It's trending that way now. And of course, it's trending that way based on data and things that have happened 6 to 9 months ago, not just today. So it's going to further exemplify. And I think we're going to see that definitely tick up in the upcoming months here. And speaking of uptick here, population. We seem to update people on the population growth almost weekly here because there's just so much data and so much incredible data coming in that we want to share it. So when it comes to Canada, population growth hit a record 1.2 million people in the past 12 months. This data is coming out quarterly here, and that 1.2 beat the previous quarter announcement of about 1.05 million. This is largely being driven by non-PRs, non-permanent residents, which is, of course, your temporary workers, your international students, and refugees. That segment of the population growth accounted for a record 60% of that increase. With that segment is targeted to grow by 730,000 people, or it did. Sorry, that is like a firm number, 730,000. For reference, if you go back 40 years, that segment of the marketplace, or of the population growth rather, grew on average about 50,000 people per year. The last 12 months, it was 730,000. It's almost 15 times the normal growth from the past 40 years. So floodgates are open. The 1.2 million accounts for 5% of Canada's population, like growing at 5% a year. Very unsustainable. This is putting extreme pressure on the rental market because, as you can imagine, most non-PRs come into Canada and they rent first prior to buying, upwards of at least 2 years, of course, unless they're just temporary workers, and that they will never really plan on buying unless they're going to get their PR and move here, etc. But when we're talking about rental rates, of course, they're basically all-time high across Canada. We're seeing, it's getting so extreme now, we're seeing ads for landlords that are renting out shared beds. Not just a shared house, not just shared bedrooms, shared beds. Okay, so like a bedroom with 2 beds is being rented out to 4 people, for example. That is how obscene the demand is getting. And yet, chances are those are going to be rented out because what is the alternative? You're not going to sleep on the street, ideally. So that's a bit of insight into what's happening when the population growth is this extreme, and we've got the basically housing market on the standstill as far as new growth.
Not only is that like an affordability issue, it's also like it's an affordability crisis. It's also turning into like a dignity crisis. Like that's pretty crazy when you consider people are renting out beds. It's like going back to a dormitory, but paying a lot more for it. It's also, Dan, like when you consider what's going on with population, what's happening with affordability, and what's happening with supply, you know, it's without a doubt in my mind that the Bank of Canada, or not the Bank of Canada, sorry, the Canadian government's trying to solve this issue by bringing in a ton more of people to fix the labor shortage, which will help with supply, but at the same time causing a whole slew of new issues that they're not prepared for. It's almost like they are going to kill the patient to kill the disease. You know, it's like instead of actually trying to cure the disease and save the patient, it's not working. It's causing more problems than it is solutions. Anyhow, with that being said, let's take a look at the Toronto market, and then we'll look at a few other marketplaces here just to see how other places are performing. Toronto area sales have dropped 7% last month. It's the largest decline since September of 2022. Still, though, sales are up 15% year over year, with a 20% specifically in condo volume increase, largely, in my mind, due to affordability, but also due to, I would assume, a lot of investors are trying to maybe unload that second or third condo that they bought 2 or 3 years ago. So we're starting to see some of those hit the market. Inventory, again, jumped 19%. This is the largest increase since 2020. Still 20% below the 10-year averages, though. So again, very low baselines. Prices have increased 2.5% last month. They're now up 9% in just 4 months, almost on par with June of last year. There are foreclosures that are beginning to rise here. That said, they're still very low. They were almost zero back in 2022. Now we're seeing about 70 foreclosure listings. An active inventory sitting around 14,500. So 70 listings represents 0.005% of the total housing market.
Yeah, those may increase, but still, when you see the foreclosures almost at record lows here, it's not a significant part of that marketplace. And these numbers are very representative of what we see here in Vancouver. But one thing that we've touched on, that we've been focusing on, and maybe these will turn into foreclosures, maybe not. But of course, the investor segment is feeling the squeeze more and more so, right? If you bought a condo and you were maybe just even at a break even prior to the rate hikes, and now you're minus, X hundred, X thousand per month, does that investment make any more sense to you? Will people start offloading those? Well, here's an example of what it would look like if you're like, okay, I want to invest in real estate and I want to buy a Toronto condo. If you approach it that way and you want to buy your typical price condo, finance it 80% loan to value and get the prevailing rates, well, you're basically going to have an output of negative $1,320 per month cash flow. That means you're negative $16,000 a year cash flow. If we go back to even 8 years ago and take those same metrics, you'd be positive $250 a month. Obviously, rates were lower, condo prices were lower. That's a almost $1,600 swing dating back to 2015. So understandably, it's a very different landscape for an investor. You're going to look at these numbers and say, look, does this pencil? Does this make sense anymore? And sure, yeah, let's count in the principal pay down. Well, you're still minus about $650. So could there be a better use for your money? Sure. So what's going to happen? Well, investors may start to offload some of this product, but who's going to buy it? It's not going to be another investor. It's going to be an end user. So what happens there? Well, you've just taken another rental market off of the marketplace. So that is going to, again, dramatically hurt the rental market. So if investors aren't going to be buying these properties and the other investors are offloading them, and end users are getting in because condos are the most affordable, just by a sheer price point, well, again, you make life even more challenging for those looking for more rentals. So again, we're not providing any solutions here, but I just want to kind of frame up what a bit of the sentiment is right now for investors looking at the condo market.
Yeah, it's I think as we continue to go into this, less and less affordable marketplace, you've got more and more buyers that are turning into more and more renters as well, right? And that is going to further exacerbate this. Let's talk about Calgary, because Calgary is probably one of, if not the most affordable province left in Canada here, and it continues to strengthen. So home sales in Calgary rose an estimated 5% month over month in June, and hits yet another record for the month. So sales in Calgary were up roughly 10% year over year, but saw an almost 50% surge in the condo segment. Overall, inventory is at a 10-year low, and this is 30% less. This is a big number. This has obviously pushed prices north. Calgary is now sitting at an all-time high of an average price of $540,000. That's still less than half of the GVRD. So Calgary or Alberta performing well, but considerably better because of its affordability and its pro-business sort of outlook. With that said, Dan, some closing thoughts here. I I think things are starting to get loud. And what I mean by that is when the Bank of Canada came out and announced its rate hike, we heard from David Eby, our premier. And he actually made some points, I think, that echo a lot of what we've said. I'll quote him. And it is, we have not yet seen the full impact. People have not renewed their mortgages yet, and businesses that are struggling under debt have not started going under yet, but they will. He went on to say, frankly, I don't believe in solutions that come at the expense of the poorest people. And to give you some perspective, his sort of perspective on how inflation should be fixed is less interest rate policy and more about how do we get our exports out to global markets and imports in with a minimum amount of friction so that we have good prices. We should be focusing on the infrastructure that we need to achieve that. And I completely agree. It's also my position that the Bank of Canada is overcorrecting, especially with where they're at right now. Much like David Eby said, we haven't seen the full impact of the decisions that were made over that 9 months of incredible rate hikes that we saw. We're only just starting to see it permeate now. So it's very possible that a lot of what's happened in the past sinks us further down than they're anticipating. And why do I believe that? Well, if you look down south and you look to the States, and our economies, they tend to mirror each other. So in 2022, the feds in the States collected $5 trillion in taxable revenue, but they spent $6.5 trillion getting through 2022. Huge numbers, right? So last month, we saw the US raise the federal debt ceiling to $6 trillion, and that's up from $4 trillion. That's a 50% increase in the budget. That means they're not going back to $4 trillion. They're staying now at $6 trillion looking forward. So how can you expect to take inflation back down to its $4 trillion number when you were sitting at 2% was the target, and now you increase spending and you increase the cash in the system by 50%, and yet you still want inflation to remain at 2%? I just don't know how this works. And honestly speaking, I think there's going to be a ton of pain to get down to 2%. And I think that this sort of philosophy should really be scrutinized over the next 3 to 6 months. And I think lastly, I just want to leave everybody with this, because this is a question that's been bugging me for the last little while, is throughout all of this, who comes out on top? Who is going to win at the end of all of this? I don't know, Dan, if you want to leave any other thoughts, but that's kind of where my mind goes.
No, that's a great place to wrap it up. Obviously open to hearing back all your feedback and comments. Please leave those below. It's feeling like a mess for many. So we'd love to hear your stories and ultimately see if there's any way that we can help. So thanks as always for tuning in, and have an awesome day.